Following a practical, repeatable, teachable system for developing leaders is an important step to delegating decision-making and problem-solving. This is part 4 of a 5-part series on how to develop up-and-coming leaders. Stay tuned and I'll share another step to address early on that's proven to work well for me when developing leaders to make solid decisions I can trust.
Running a service business can be hard. It is not unusual for business owners in industries like contracting, home repair, auto repair, business-to-business services like janitorial, IT and accounting, and many others to feel overwhelmed by all the priorities facing them at any given time. Between addressing the needs of the customers, managing the employees, figuring out the financials, and getting processes in place, feeling like you're making significant progress on your business journey can be difficult. Welcome to Service Industry Success, hosted by Brian Harding. Each week, Brian will look at real-world strategies for building the business you are dreaming of, while also sharing tactics to get through some of the most frustrating parts of business ownership with a lot more ease. Let's get started.
For many business owners and leaders, a problem they're desperately wanting to solve is developing effective leaders in their organization, so they can delegate decision-making, problem-solving, and just to get out of the weeds so they can focus on other things. So while this is both important and urgent, it's also common to not have certainty about where to start. And that's exactly what we're covering in this 5-part series, a practical series of strategies to develop leaders we can trust. So as I mentioned after the first two, from here on out, these aren't necessarily steps, to be taken rigidly in a sequential order, like step by step by step. Taking care of one before the other probably won't be that big of a deal. But these are concepts and strategies I want to get out in front of early rather than later. And one of the keys to successful leadership I've seen as an employee, as a peer, as a person helping leaders develop, is something we've all probably learned, and we get reminders about it periodically. And that is that the biggest breakthroughs come when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But just knowing this in some kind of abstract way isn't all that helpful. Being reminded about that every 3 or 4 months and, oh yeah, that's a good thing to remember. And then we forget about 17 seconds later. I don't think that's all that helpful. But if we accept both these truths, one, that our biggest breakthroughs come when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, and two, knowing that in an abstract way isn't all that helpful, we come to the logical conclusion that we need to intentionally incorporate vulnerability into our leadership process. That doesn't mean that we just do it randomly. And I found a good place to start is by simply becoming aware of our drivers and the drivers of the team we want to lead. So as a leader, if I have a boss and I have a team of people, I need to know what my drivers are, and I want to know what the team's drivers are. And if I'm the CEO or the president or the general manager or the business owner and I have a team of leaders under me, I want them to know what the drivers of their teams are, but I need to know what the drivers of the leadership team is. And I think this is especially true of the leadership team. So I, as well as the up-and-coming leader, need to be aware of what the leader's drivers are. So if I have a ops manager and an office manager and a sales manager, for example, I need to know what the driver is for the ops manager. I need to know what the driver is for the sales manager, the office manager, etc. And one of the things we just have to remember is we're all trying to get some more of some things and less of other things. We're all trying to run towards what we wanted when we were a 3 or 4 year old kid and run away from the things that we didn't like when we were 3 or 4 years old. These are things that are behaviorally ingrained into us. Most of these things we learn as very young people. It's not likely these things were developed when somebody was 23 or 26. Most of these things are developed pretty early on in life. But I want to know what these things are for my leadership team because I need to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, just like I need to know what my own strengths and weaknesses are. And the leadership team, the individual leader, the ops manager needs to know what his or her strengths and weaknesses are and what their natural inclinations are and what happens if those things go unchecked and they go too far. So, of course, we want to know what the drivers of the team, the developing the leader, is charged with. We want to know what makes them go. And that leader, the ops manager, needs to know for the operations team what makes those people go collectively and individually. Now, as a business owner, if I have 50 employees, I can't know that for 50 people. I need to know it for my leadership team, and they need to know it for the people they're charged with leading. And I want to make sure that I'm clear about that, but that's not what I'm going to focus on here. In this episode, I'm focusing on just me and the leader. So the leader, the ops manager needs to know for the team they lead what those people's drivers are, but I'm not going to focus on that in this episode. I'm specifically talking about I need to focus on what drives that leader, the ops manager, for example, or the sales manager or the office manager. I need to know what drives each of these individuals. And I need them to get comfortable with this knowledge as well. They need to understand for themselves what makes them go. And this is not something I've found that many people have a whole lot of understanding with. They get the concept, but they don't really understand what makes them go and what they understand what they like and what they don't like. I don't mean to say that they don't know that, but they don't understand what the kinds of drivers are that we all have and the consequences of letting those things go unchecked. So while there's lots of variables, generally all of us, including me, are aiming for one of the following. And this list has come from, there's all kinds of different personality assessments. There's the DISC one. There's I took one when I was in my early 20s called BEST. There's tons of these things, but generally speaking, what we determine is it comes down to like four different things. We all are either trying to be or prioritize one of these four things. We all either want to be liked, to be recognized, to win, or to be right. Now, there's tons of variables and nobody is deeply immersed in one of those camps and not the others. There's lots of variables. I fully accept that, but primarily all of us, we're aiming for one of those things, and none of those drivers are good or bad in and of themselves. Like they're all fine. However, all of these drivers, when allowed to go unchecked, are absolutely catastrophic. Now, personally, I'm driven to be right. As you can probably tell by listening to this podcast, if you listen at all, I generally have my facts in order. That's just what I'm driven by. But as a leader, if that driver goes unchecked, if I'm the only one who ever allowed to be right, that would not be a very pleasant environment for people to work within. They wouldn't like it. And if I'm the only one who ever gets to be right, taken to the natural extreme, people will just quit trying. If satisfying my desire to be right is the primary objective, why would they keep trying? Because if I let my driver trump what is going on and I always have to be the one to be right, I'll constantly change the rules of the game so that I'm always right. And that would not be a very fun place to work, admittedly. And especially if you had two or three people like that in charge, holy smokes, it would not be fun at all. Right. So here's where it gets interesting, though, I think. Generally, most of us believe that we are better than average at keeping our driver from getting out of whack. And generally, most of us believe that most of the leaders we've had or we've worked for do not. So we think we overestimate how good we are at keeping this in check, and we are it's pretty easy for us to see how other people don't do that very well. Most of us would rate the majority of bosses we've had as not that great. When I talk to people and I ask, like, how many different people have you worked for? And, like say 10. Well, how many would you say were exceptionally good leaders? If any, the answer is always like 1, 2, or 3. It's not like, oh yeah, all 10 were fantastic. It's not like that. That's not the experience most of us have had. So most of us would say the majority of bosses we've had are not that great. And if pressed, most would say that the reason that they weren't great is because they placed a higher value on the boss getting what they wanted, satisfying their driver, than they place on the overall success of the team. So think about the crummy bosses you've had. It's very likely you think they were crummies because they always had to be right. They always wanted to be acknowledged for the wins. They were not willing to address issues to make sure that they didn't have to be the bad guy. They wanted to be liked, or they always had to win. And I've talked about bosses I've had on this podcast before, and all of them fall in one of those four categories. There's one guy that I've talked about specifically a few times. He absolutely had to win no matter what. And if it meant the team just getting kicked in the stomach to make it happen, it didn't matter. He had to be the one who was recognized for the wins. When his boss came in from out of town, all the good things that happened were because of him. And he was not discreet about that. And people despised him because of that. I worked for another guy I've talked about on here before. That guy absolutely had to win no matter what. He had to win every argument. He had to win every case, every situation where he declared a thing. Like, he had to win no matter. The people had to know he won no matter what. And they despised him for it. So if we all overestimate our ability to keep our drivers from dominating, and simultaneously we all recognize that most bosses don't keep their drivers in check, it's a solid indication that we can't just trust our own judgment on this, I think. We're very likely to overestimate our ability to keep a proper balance and underestimate the damage satisfying our deepest internal need is causing, because these are deep needs. These are not superficial things like, people who want to, I'll just take me for example, people who want to be right. It's not something that's like a fleeting thing that comes and goes. Like this is a major driver in how we make decisions. People who want to be liked, it's the same thing. And people who want to be liked and prioritize that, it's not a thing that comes and goes. It's a deep emotional driver. So the solution, one of the things I've seen work successfully, both being taught this as an up and coming leader myself, again, just by the grace of God, having good mentors, and done this myself with leaders I'm developing, it's kind of twofold. First, I need to get the up and coming leader to identify their own driver. So do they want to be liked, recognized? They want to win, um, liked, recognized, win, or be right? One of those four. They need to acknowledge what it is, identify what it is, and for understand the damage that could be done if in their particular situation with their team, if that driver were to go unchecked. And secondly, I need to actively demonstrate how I do this myself. So there's kind of two things here. They need to understand what the driver is and what the consequences if it gets out of whack. And the second thing is I need to actively demonstrate how I intentionally, objectively try to overcome this in my own case. So if I have a leader, for example, whose driver is being liked, they need to understand how that left unchecked could damage the team. Things like, they might avoid problems that would result in uncomfortable conversations because people who want to be liked do not like uncomfortable conversations. We have to hold people accountable. They just don't like it. And if that happens, then we're placing an unreasonable burden on employees to deal with those unresolved problems. Employees won't bring up problems anymore because they don't believe they'll be dealt with. Employees will start feeling that things are quote unquote unfair because the boss let some people get away with not doing the right thing. But people who have strong personalities, they might not be held to the same standard because it's difficult for the boss who wants to be liked to have those confrontational conversations with an employee who has a strong personality and isn't quite meeting the standard. Well, that's going to create a disparity in how employees are treated, and they will walk away with a perception of unfairness. So that would be an example for somebody who wants to be liked, how that could manifest in the real world. So they need to understand the consequences of their driver taking priority. If you let your driver take priority in the case of somebody who wants to be liked, these are the natural consequences. This is the outcomes we're going to see. These are the problems that employees are going to feel, which are much different than mine. People in my situation, if somebody who wants to be right goes unchecked, people will just, it's just not worth the fight. It's just, you better come armed and ready to go. And people just, they don't like that again and again. So all these things have different kinds of consequences, and it's all depending on how our team and how they would deal with it. But we need to understand what those consequences could be. Also, and simultaneously, I need to demonstrate how I overcome my own shortcomings and keep my drivers from taking over. So what I want to avoid is a situation where people believe that the higher you are in the org chart, the less accountable one is for their own behavior. So, and this is a common thing that people, when they get promoted or even people manager people you hire from outside, there is this kind of underlying belief in some cases, maybe many cases, where the frontline employees, they need to keep their behavior in check, but once you get a certain status, like that goes out the window. And that's just very common, and I want to make sure I'm avoiding that at all costs. That is, for me personally, that is something I actively want to make sure and dispel any belief of that right out of the gate. So in my case, I explain what it looks like when my need to be right takes over. I get curt. I get, when things are going sideways, I get short. I get curt. I withdraw. I do these things. And more importantly, I had to explain when this happens, which is very predictable. It's going to happen. Things aren't always going to be perfect. Here's what I want you to do when you see these behaviors. And I'm going to require that they do these things that make them feel uncomfortable. I'm going to require somebody who wants to be liked. Yeah, well, we all want to be liked, but you can't avoid confrontation because you want to be liked, which is wildly uncomfortable for people who are driven by being liked. So if I'm going to require them to step out and have that kind of vulnerability, it's absolutely my role as a leader to demonstrate the exact same vulnerability I'm going to expect from them. And so not only do I get to, I get better myself as a leader by having a team of people hold me accountable for my behavior, but I also remove any excuse not to do this from the up and coming leader. If I'm doing it, they have no excuse not to do it. And that's one of the key things I want to really implement here. So it's the benefits are pretty wide ranging in my opinion. One, we establish a culture where the higher you are in the org chart doesn't mean you're less responsible for your behaviors, which I think is catastrophic. And I've worked in organizations where that was catastrophic. And I don't mean like catastrophic, like the business went out of business. I just mean the culture was not good because there was this kind of prevailing thought that the higher you are in the org chart, the more you could just behave however you wanted, and subordinate employees just had to deal with it. We all have heard stories. If you're over 40, you've heard stories of managers and bosses like throwing things. And what I've worked for bosses who've thrown everything from eyeglasses to chairs, and it's catastrophic to the culture. So the wide range of benefits are not only do we establish a culture where it's the belief that the higher you are in the org chart, the less you're responsible for your behavior. That goes out the window, but also leaders require they develop really strong skills that are really well balanced, and I'll talk about that more in here in a second. So, but my point is, the benefits of this are pretty wide ranging, I would say. So again, not only do I get better myself by having a team of people who are in leadership roles in the company, even though they're subordinate leadership roles, they're still leadership roles in the company, holding me accountable for my behavior. But there's no excuse for them not to do it themselves. And I need that because this takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability for people to step out of these things that really, really drive us. But the real benefit, for my opinion, comes from aside from the things we talked about already, like the cultural benefits. But the benefits really come from when the developing leader starts seeing how being mindful of not letting their driver get carried away starts to pay off in real world situations, which it will again and again and again over time. They will come back and say, holy smokes, my natural inclination would have been to avoid the situation or to be abrasive and demanding or whatever. And I didn't do that because I know that that's my natural inclination. And I know I need to not do that in this situation. And holy smokes, here's what happened. Those stories will start to come back. And when they do, it's awesome. It's absolutely amazing. Just not only to see people develop new skills, which makes them incredibly, much better leaders, but to actually see the benefits of this vulnerability. And we all know the greatest breakthroughs come when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. But when we actually see real world examples of that happening in real time, they go have a conversation that they wanted to avoid with an employee, or they go have a conversation where their inclination was to be authoritarian and they didn't do that, and they get much better buy-in. All these things really start to happen in the real world, and it's awesome when it does. So they become exceptional leaders, and at least in my experience. And when they experience that, they're even more willing to be vulnerable in the future, and the more vulnerable they are, the more breakthroughs they're going to have. The more breakthroughs they have, the better the organization runs. And they teach their team how to do this stuff. And pretty soon you have a group of people from the top to the bottom who are all willing to have this vulnerability. And they're all doing things that are benefit the organization over our individual needs, and the benefits really begin to compound. So this is something that I don't hear talked about a whole lot in a practical sense, but I can tell you from my experience of developing a leadership team and also having been the beneficiary of somebody developing me like this, 25 years ago when I didn't know anything about leadership, this is absolutely huge. So this is why it's part of the 5-part series we're covering here. This is something that, it's not a one-time conversation. It's a series of actions over a prolonged period of time, but the benefits, in my opinion, are off the charts. So anyhow, I hope that helps. If you find the information I share here helpful, please share this podcast with a friend or colleague you think could benefit from it. And of course, public sharing is also appreciated. And that's it for this week. And I'll talk to y'all next week.